Hey everyone, I'm D.L. Watson, filmmaker, VFX artist, etc. Sean from Rampant Design Tools graciously invited me out to NAB this year to do a presentation on an effect I did for the Graveyard Cars teaser trailer. So let's go ahead and bring that up and I'll show it to you here. I also edited this trailer together and used Rampant Design Tools glitch effects from the Distortion pack to add all these nice, beautiful glitches. And the effect that I'm going to break down is going to be right here. Shows the 69 Dodge Charger there with the Graveyard Cars logo. So yeah, pretty cool little teaser that I put together. So let's go ahead and show you how I did this through a breakdown. So I'm here in my After Effects project and I'm using Adobe After Effects CC 2014. And this entire effect was done using Element 3D version 2. Now, I am cheating a little bit when I say that because I did render out several passes. So I rendered out a ambient occlusion pass, a shadow pass, Z-depth path, and all that stuff, and then recomposited those passes in another project file, which we'll get to in just a second. But I just wanted to quickly run through this setup here and kind of talk about how I set the scene up. So all these assets are from Turbo Squid. In fact, I have them up here, right here. So I purchased the graveyard assets here. It's a nice collection of tombstones and trees and all this stuff. And this comes in not built like you see it in this image here. You have to kind of build it yourself. And so I opened them up in 3ds Max and kind of built this kind of like this and just kind of edited it so that way a car could fit in this driveway kind of thing, and made it customized to my needs. But for the most part, it's pretty much derivative of that image. And so you can see here we have the 69 Charger here, and I've extended out the platform to make it where it makes sense a car can fit there. And then I put these bowls here because I know that later I'm going to add some rampant fire. So one of the first things I did was import those assets after I exported them from 3ds Max, and I brought them in here to Element, and I just retextured them, the graveyard assets, using the textures from the actual supplied pack. Since the car was designed for V-Ray, I had to basically retexture this, which wasn't hard. I just had to basically take the paint red that came stock with Element 3D and kind of make it more of a burnt orange, and I changed the reflection on it to be spherical, so that way it will actually reflect the entire environment here and the tombstones and all that good stuff, just to add a little bit of realism to it. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump back into After Effects here. And one of the first things that I did was create a camera and basically did this animation where the camera starts off really close to the car, right here where it says Charger RT, and then it just kind of slowly dollies out to reveal the whole scene. So I could have just left it like this and said, yep, done boss, ready to go. Or I could make it look pretty awesome. So what I did from here is added some more lights. As you can see, I have one light up here at the top that kind of adds a little bit of nighttime, nice key light to light the whole area. And to justify that light, I found this asset of the moon and basically imported it in as a 3D object in After Effects and placed it back in Z-Space. So as you can see here, I have it here, and if I move it forward and backward in Z-Space, you can see it changes its position. So I added that there to kind of justify all the light that you see. And then what I did is I wanted to add some light to where we see these fog lamps. And let's see if we can bump up the resolution here so you can see. So I added these two fog lamps here, and just some 3D lights that are tracked in with the scene. And as you can see, there's creating some illumination here on this gargoyle, and looks pretty cool. So the next thing I did was add a little bit of fill light to this back area stuff. So I threw a light back here, and as you can see, as I toggle this on and off, it just adds a little bit of detail to the scene that would otherwise have gotten lost in the color grading. So I added another kicker up here at the top where it kind of adds a little bit of light to kind of kick the edges here, and it looks really nice. So the next thing I wanted to do was add a little bit of contrast light to bring out these tombstones over here because they're pretty dark, and so I added a nice warm light just to kind of bring it up a little bit, just to add a little bit. So in the color grading, this will kind of show off as a little warm. So yeah, that's pretty much what I did there. And as you can see, we have ambient occlusion turned on and shadows and all that good stuff. And I just rendered out each pass. And let's go ahead and jump into my After Effects project where I comped this all together. So let me just load that up. Alright, so as you can see here, this is getting closer to the finished product, but let's go ahead and jump back in time to the original VFX comp here and go all the way down and solo what I started with, which was this. So as you can see, I have this render, and it's just the composite. There's no shadows, no ambient occlusion, nothing. It's just a plain scene, and it looks very cartoony, something like you would see in a late 90s, early 2000s video game. Pretty cool that you could do this in After Effects, but it just needs a little bit of tweaking. So let's go ahead and bring in the ambient occlusion pass, and as you can see, once I toggle that on, it just adds a little bit of nice detail up here in the crevices, and just makes it look a little bit more realistic. And that is using the ray traced ambient occlusion that Element version 2 now supplies. And the next thing I did was, here is the shadow pass. As you can see, I added this to the effects with one small change. I created this fire mask. So as you can see here, we have these solids here, and they represent the areas which I want the shadows to disappear. I don't want the shadows to exist in these areas. And the reason for that is because I know that later, let me go back here, I know that these bowls are going to have fire shooting out of them. So let me just jump back in here to the and turn that on so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So when I toggle this, I want fire to come from these areas. So I know that that's going to create a little bit of fill light here and a little bit of light on the grill that otherwise would look really dark. But it wouldn't make sense if you're having this light source flame right here, and this wouldn't be so dark. It would actually be reflecting the fire here. So what I wanted to do was just make sure that these areas stayed clean from shadows. And I can see the opacity on this one's brought down a lot because, you know, there's fire way over here. It wouldn't be so extreme. The shadows wouldn't be completely gone here. They'd be just subtle here. So jumping back into the comp here, what does this mean? How does this translate? When you add that mask as an alpha inverted matte, then that shadow element, as we select it here and turn it on, as we toggle that on and off, we're throwing shadows in there, but we're just taking out some of the shadows from the grill and kind of bringing this down a little bit. So it just makes it look a little bit nicer and not so crazy. So the next thing I did was I wanted, since I know I'm going to add fire here, I need to make sure that this is relit to represent the fire and have some nice color thrown on here. So I basically duplicated this fire mask, added a tint to it, and I changed it to soft light. That way, as you zoom in here, it just makes sense to see all this light and this coloration going on, and it just adds a little bit more realism to it. Now you might ask, well, why didn't you use screen? Well, screen becomes a little obvious and not as realistic, so by using the soft light, it just makes it look like I'm relighting the scene, and it just makes it look more realistic. Alright, so then moving on, the next thing I did was I needed to track the scene because this is a 2D image now. It's no longer the Element 3D, so I'm not working with actually the camera. So I went back down to the composite and turned on the 3D camera tracker so I can track this scene. That way I can actually add 2D elements into this 3D scene. And basically I selected these areas here around these bowls because I know I'm going to add some fire to it. And so when the 3D track was done and I generated my camera, I brought in some Rampant Design Tools fire and started laying those in. So just so you can see, the first one here, I added a mask to it, and I was going to toggle that on so you can see we have some nice fire. So when we toggle those fire elements on, let's jump back in here and turn them all on. As you can see, it just adds a nice bit of awesome to it. The fire is creating light and it's reflecting and it's all looking pretty sweet, but we're not done yet because it still looks a little crisp. It still looks a little cartoony and CG. So one of the things that I did was take this Z-depth pass and I brought it down in exposure, and that way when I apply it as a screen matte, it creates the illusion of fog. So it just adds a little bit of fog to the scene, kind of takes down some of the color saturation, and just makes it look really nice. And it also, because it's a Z-depth map, it changes as the camera moves, just like fog does. So it's really nice. A nice simple way to add a little bit of fog to your scene is just rendering out a Z-depth pass. But I'm not done there yet. I need to add a little bit of texture to that fog. So I went online and found some fog cloud textures that are royalty free, and they're just images, and I just brought them in to the composition. So I used the Z-depth pass as a lumimat to push the fog cloud element, the sky, back in Z space. So when we turn that on, as you can see, it's kind of hovering back here in the background, and it's kind of like overlapping over the top of this car. And then I animated it so that way, as you can see here, I've got some animation keyframes. So it looks like it's kind of rolling in as this fog, and it just adds another little bit of sweetness to it. And just kind of spices it up a little bit. So it's looking pretty cool, but we need something in the foreground. So we're creating some composition rules here. We got something back here. We need to weigh it out and add a little bit here as well. So I just went ahead and duplicated that and then inverted the animation so it just looks cool. So we've got this fog element. Now, what I need to do is add a little bit of glow to these lights because they're creating a light source, and again, it's all about just creating the illusion of realism here. So we're gonna go ahead and just toggle those on, and it just adds a little bit of luminosity to that area. And again, those are also tracked in Z space, so they move with the animation. The next thing I did was add a little depth of field using the depth of field plugin from Lens Care. So if I jump here and then we turn this guy on, let's see, where is it at? Right here, and we toggle it on. You can see as I toggle on and off, it just adds a nice bit of depth of field, and we get this nice realistic bokeh in the background. Very subtle. I didn't want it too much. I didn't want it to be too crazy. I mean, you can ramp this up if you want. If I made it 20 and let it think for a second, you can see I can really crush it and make it look like it was shot like on VistaVision or something. So I'll bring that back down because I just wanted it to be a little subtle. And now that we've added the depth of field, I just want to add a little bit of glow just to diffuse the image a little bit. All right, so the next thing I did was add in the title, and it kind of zooms in here, and that was another rendered pass and element. So as we pan out, the title comes into play here, and made it black to make it contrast with the more lighter background, and that looks pretty sweet. So here comes into some of my subjective methods of making this look pretty awesome. Some people will agree with me, some people won't. I'm the kind of guy where I do my visual effects, I want to try to make it look as realistic as I possibly can. So I will add in lens distortion, and I just use the Bezier warp, and what it does is it just kind of hugs in the corners here like we're shooting with a spherical lens, and so as the camera pans in, it kind of warps the image and pushes it up just like a normal lens would do, and it just makes it look cool. So after we add the lens distortion, we're going to go ahead and add another controversial thing that most people probably wouldn't do, but I do, and that's just to take away some of the sharpness of the image. So what I do is I add a fast blur at 1 pixel and an unsharp mask at 100%, and you might be thinking to yourself like, what the crap, man, that's not... You don't do that. Well, I do, and I think it helps enhance the quality of the effect and makes it look more filmic, and in the end, when it's all said and done, it matches with the footage a lot better. So if we zoom in here, I'll give you an example. So if we come in here to this beginning part here, I'm going to go ahead and just toggle this on, and as you can see, it just takes away some of that edge, but it doesn't remove the sharpness from the image, the overall sharpness of the image. So you're blurring it and then sharpening it, and it just takes away that hard edge, and that's what all I'm trying to achieve there. It's a very subtle effect. It's not crazy, but it just works really well. And yeah, that's what I do. So now that we have this, the next thing I need to do is apply Real Smart Motion Blur. So I bring it into a new composition, and then I add the effect from Revision Effects called Real Smart Motion Blur. And if we turn that on, as you can see, as it'll just add a little bit of blur to the image, especially right here in this area. If we toggle it on and off, it's adding blur because the camera is dollying back. And so if you were to actually shoot, with an actual camera and a 180-degree shutter, you would get this motion blur. And a lot of people forget to turn motion blur on when they're working in visual effects, and it just is a telltale sign that it's actually a CG effect. And it doesn't look very good. You might be asking yourself, why didn't I just use the motion blur that came out of Element 3D? Well, the reason is because sometimes motion blur can cause problems in compositing. You might be trying to pull a Lumimat, or you might be trying to key something, or whatever it may be. You might run into an issue with it just because it's blurring the edges of something. By applying it in post, you have that nice sharp clean edge for all your comp work, and then you can apply all the motion blur, and again, it just unifies the entire scene together, so everything blurs with it and it looks really nice. Alright, so the final bit of subjective editing on this. So I pre-compose it one more time, and then I add some more effects to it. So one of the things that I like to do is add lens dirt to my VFX. And again, like I said, it's about unifying the visual effects, make them look like they were shot right there on a set. And even though they may not look photorealistic, it's just about creating the illusion of realism. So I went ahead and generated some lens grime. This is some custom lens grime that I developed a couple years ago. I really like them, and it just adds a nice little bit of realism to the scene, because the camera guy, he's doing everything. He's setting up the lights, he's getting the camera on the tripod, and he's making sure exposure's set right and all that stuff. Sometimes he just forgets to wipe the lens off and get the dirt off of it. So by having that element in your visual effects, it adds a nice subtle bit of realism to it. And when I say subtle, it is pretty subtle, because when I turn this on, it is very subtle. And so let's go ahead and turn that on. And did you notice that it's on now? If we jump down in here, you can see this bokeh, and that is actually the lens element out of focus, because the lens element wouldn't be in focus in real life. So here it is with the bokeh turned off. It wouldn't actually be in focus because right now we're focused on this element in Z space, so everything on the lens itself would be out of focus because we're not focused on the lens. So if we turn that on and just add a little blur to it, it just adds a little bit of nice unique texture to the highlight areas. And the way I do that is by duplicating this footage. And let's go ahead and just turn that on so you can see, and let's turn these off so you can see what I did. So I duplicated the source footage, and I added a tint to it, a fast blur, and a levels adjustment. So now you can see that I have these nice big highlights here, and then I basically use a Lumimat on the lens grime using the footage as the mat itself, and that way when we look at it by itself, you can see that it's only going to show the areas which are highlighted, and just add a little bit of texture to those particular areas. And so then you get this nice little bit of texture in the highlights. So the next thing I did was add a little bit of film grain. Not just your typical film grain, we're talking about digital grain. And I actually generated this from a DSLR. And if we jump in here, it's really subtle. You may not be able to see it, so let's jump back into the composition and look at this by itself. And we'll turn up the opacity. And so if I scrub through here, you can see that we've got some film grain, some digital grain actually I should say. And I created this from a DSLR, exporting out a raw image sequence of this grain, and imported it in. Now you might be thinking, what the heck are you doing? Again, I'm just trying to add a little bit of realism to it to make it look like that we actually went out to a graveyard with our DSLR and filmed this graveyard with this car there. Just degrading the image quality just enough just to add a little bit of realism to it, because it doesn't need to be so sharp, it doesn't need to be so clean, because the footage that takes place before it isn't that sharp, isn't that clean. It is all DSLR footage. I'm trying to match my visual effects with the DSLR. So again, just adding that in there, and let's bring that back down to 32. And so as it plays through, again, it adds a little bit of subtle texture to it, which is why I like films like The Hobbit and stuff like that I have a problem with, because it's textureless. And the next thing I did was add a vignette to it. And some people like vignettes, some people don't, but lenses tend to cause vignettes, especially if you're working with lower end budget lenses like we do here at the Division. One thing that people make the mistake of when they actually create vignettes is they just create a solid black layer with a mask and they add a classic color burn to it and they call it done. Well, real lenses, when they add a vignette, actually desaturate the edges, and as you can see here, it's increasing the saturation. So what I did is I created an adjustment layer, copied the mask from the vignette from the black solid layer, applied it to the adjustment layer, and added tint to it. So that way when we turn it on, it just takes away some of that hard saturation that we see in the corners. All right, so that's pretty much done. That's pretty much what I did there, and it looks pretty nice. If we scrub through here, we can see that looks pretty sweet, but there's one thing that's missing from this, and that is color correction. So what I did is I rendered this out, and I went over to Casey Ferris, one of my buddies and worst enemies with groundcontrolcolor.com, and had him do some color correction on this. And when it was all said and done, it looks like this. And yeah, looks really sweet. Nice bit of contrast, nice color choice, looks really nice, and it made it into the trailer. So that's my breakdown of this visual effects element. I hope that it was helpful for you. Hope it gave you some ideas and inspired you. And thanks again to Rampant Design Tools for inviting me out to NAB 2015. I had a lot of fun. I look forward to going again in the future, and so yeah, check them out. They have some great assets there. The Fire Elements really sold this, and I'm really excited to use their assets in the future. All right, I'm DL Watson, filmmaker, VFX artist, etc. You can check me out at my website at dlwfilms.com, or you can check me out at my YouTube channel or my Facebook page. Until next time, thanks for watching, and film on, guys.